The journalist Kevin Fedarko admits it. He had no business trying to hike the length of the Grand Canyon from east to west. Even if you break it into sections, which was the idea, we're talking about a trek that amounts to 750 miles of zigzagging trails, 1,000-foot walls, shaky ledges, not to mention intense heat and barely any water above the river. The trip was Pete's idea. You'll meet him here in a bit, but Fedarko signed on, even though it was, as he puts it, a conflation of willful ignorance and outrageous hubris. But the Grand Canyon does something to you. In his new book, Fedarko says it did something to him, and it did something to a man named Colin Fletcher.
Colin Fletcher was a middle-aged man in the 1960s who, by the time he stumbled onto the Grand Canyon, had already lived more lives than many other people in an entire lifetime. He'd been a young soldier who participated in the D-Day invasion in Normandy. He'd been a farmer in Africa. He had worked a whole series of jobs across North America. He was someone who would evolve into a figure who would be considered the godfather of modern American backpacking. But in those days, all of that kind of fame still lay ahead. And he was in the midst of a cross-country road trip with a friend from the East Coast to the West Coast. And he decided when they reached Flagstaff that they were just going to veer north for a, 1.5-hour drive to this giant chasm in this big national park that lay just to the north. And he found himself walking across a parking lot with a set of expectations based on the fact that he'd seen the Grand Canyon countless times in photographs and postcards, and he sort of thought he knew what was going to greet him at the edge of that abyss. And like so many of us, he arrived at the edge. He found himself staring into this giant hole in the ground, absolutely transfixed. There were shadows, a limitless array, each extending at precisely the same distance in proportion to the height of its source, each pointing in exactly the same direction, suffusing the core of the chasm with texture and reach and dimensionality. The sheer force of the canyon's magnificence, the dignity of its bearing, the sternness of its architecture, all of that left the restless Welshman wide-eyed and spellbound. But what truly clobbered him was the stillness and the tranquility of the stone, an absolute dearth of sound or movement. The quiescence was heavy, mysterious, distinctly unnerving, yet strangely beckoning, too. A silence so profound, he would later write, that the whole colossal chaos of rock and space and color seemed to have sunk beneath it. In those initial moments of shock, as he took in the unruffled solemnity of this monumental crevice, he felt a shift take place inside him as both his perception and his equilibrium were nudged into a new alignment. I knew that something had happened, he said, to the way I looked at things. Like Fletcher, I was in my mid-30s by the time I arrived at the Grand Canyon. Unlike Fletcher, and unlike most people who are experiencing Grand Canyon for the first time, I didn't drive up to the south rim and look into it from above. I experienced it from the bottom in a boat on the river, and I floated through its doorway and watched the layers of rock, the successive layers of rock, climb from the shoreline into the sky. It's one of those landscape features that speak to the power of land and its ability to kind of grab us by the lapels and change us in a fundamental way.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Colin Fletcher became the first person, I guess the first white person that we know of, to walk the length of the Grand Canyon National Park in 1963. A river guide named Kenton Grua went even further in 1977. He walked the entire length of the canyon, even the part outside of the park. And both men are featured in Fedarko's new book. It's called A Walk in the Park. The book is about his own hike from end to end in the canyon. It took him more than a year. So there's plenty of adventure stories, but the book is kind of a memoir, too, about his father, who was dying of cancer. There's natural history here. He also accounts for the 11 Native American tribes who have deep connections to the Grand Canyon. Now, when you think about how incredible the place is, Fedarko says there's this paradox in the story. The Spanish conquistadors who first approached the South Rim in the 16th century, they weren't that impressed.
I've always thought that this is one of the most noteworthy and ironic and kind of wondrous aspects of the canyon, and one that so few of us truly appreciate and understand. And in order to kind of grasp it, you need to step back to the distant autumn of the year 1540, in October of that year, when a party of Spanish conquistadors were exploring the Southwest in the hopes of finding the 7 cities of Cibola, which, legend had informed them were filled with riches for the looting. These were riches that rivaled the storehouses and the treasure houses of the Aztecs and the Incas. These were men bent on, stealing gold and gems and getting rich. And a small party was sent off from the main column to explore a rumor that somewhere off to the north lay this great chasm with a river along the bottom. And so they spent several days moving across what we now know as the Painted Desert, and reached the edge of the Grand Canyon. We believe it may have been somewhere near a place now known as Grandview, which is on the South Rim. And it's noteworthy because Grandview, for those of your listeners who are familiar with it, there's a building known as the Desert Watchtower. And it sits there because it's an extraordinary place to look at the canyon. One of the things that you can take in is the great bend where the first 67, 68 miles of Grand Canyon switches from a north-south axis and bends on this enormous pivot and turns towards a primarily east-west orientation, which it will hold for the rest of the way to the Grand Wash Cliffs at the terminus of the canyon, far to the west. And that bend is defined by a series of cliffs known as the Palisades of the Desert. And the rock there it holds the color and the light. And it must have been an amazing thing for that party of horsemen and foot soldiers to look into it and see this thing that dwarfed any landscape feature in Europe, in the world that they knew. But they stared into this thing, and they spent a couple days moving along the edge of it, and they came to the conclusion that it had no worth or value whatsoever. And they turned away, and they resumed their journey in search of the 7 cities of Cibola, and they never came back. And no one else ever came back for a couple hundred years. And what that speaks to, I think, is that these were men who were calibrating the worth of the land according to a very different set of metrics from those with which we measure it today. They were looking for a harder grade of wealth than aesthetics or beauty or silence, or the kind of scale that can dwarf a human being and make him or her feel a fundamentally kind of titanic shift in their perspective and how they see themselves in relation to the larger forces that have shaped and created the world and the universe. And the other thing to note is that because they, discovered it, I'm using that in quotation marks, in 1540, it was the first great landscape feature of North America to be encountered by Europeans. And yet it was the last to be explored because it wouldn't be until the summer of 1869 that a man named John Wesley Powell would lead a group of 10 men, including himself, in 4 wooden boats down the first journey in recorded history along the river that runs through the bottom of the canyon. So it's this marvelous moment that brings together themes and ideas that kind of define the canyon in terms of how we see it and what we think it means.
You know, it's interesting. I think a lot of people who don't know the canyon think about making your way through it by going way of the river, right? And this is something that you write about, that humans for a very long time have made their way through that canyon, not just through the river, but through these trails. And I wanted to sort of ask you about those routes, the dozens and dozens of routes that were established by the ancestral Puebloans that you mentioned. What were the trails? What was the idea of moving through that space that we think of as, you access and mostly encounter by way of the river?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question to ask, and maybe one way to start is to begin by acknowledging that for those of us who are the descendants of Europeans, the river is the pathway into and the highway through the canyon and the only thoroughfare that makes any sense. Right. And so that's why we think of, the beginning of our kind of a real encounter as a culture with the canyon. Our exploration of this landscape is something that begins in the summer of 1869 with John Wesley Powell's boat trip.
Right.
And Powell took boats because this is a landscape. This is one of the most fragmented and broken and shattered piece of topography on the entire continent. And it's also stripped down to bare rock throughout most of it. Mm. And what that means is that the land itself is defined and put together in a way that resists human progress, human movement with ease on foot in a linear manner. I mean, it just makes no sense to try and move through this landscape from east to west, from what is now Lee's Ferry to what's now the Grand Wash Cliffs on foot. Water is just a much easier way to move through it. And so we think of the rock, the world of the rock that begins on the edges of the river and extends up to the rims of the canyon as the place where no one goes. But as you just pointed out, Doug, people have been moving through this and connecting with it and occupying it for centuries, for millennia. And there's a whole network of ancient trails which offer testament to the fact that Native Americans really understood how to move inside of this landscape on foot long before the descendants of Europeans ever arrived. It's also worth noting, however, that the vast majority of those trails connect the rims of the canyon to the bottom of the canyon, and they exploit fault lines in the geology, cracks in the layers of rock that allow you to move down through the cliffs from the rim to the river. There are not a lot of trails that we are aware of that actually connect the east end of Grand Canyon to the west end of Grand Canyon. Yeah. So there you have a paradox as well.
Well, is it like moving through time as you descend into these layers or go back up? Because I gathered that the hike was moving up and moving down, but you're also moving through these layers, these actual geological layers that tell you something about time. Do you get that sense when you're traveling that way?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And it's not just like moving through time. It is literally moving through time.
Yeah.
I mean, one really great way to think about the canyon is it's a giant time machine. I mean, just think about the fact that, if you start at any trailhead on either the North or the South Rim of the Grand Canyon, you're standing on a layer of rock known as the Kaibab limestone. That dates back roughly 224 million years into the past. That's a heck of a long time ago. I mean, that is a couple hundred years before the giant asteroid that struck the Yucatan Peninsula, that wiped out the dinosaurs and cleared the decks in terms of the biology of the planet for the rise of mammals and primates and human beings. Right? This took place long before any of that ever occurred, and that's where the clock starts at Grand Canyon. And as you move down from the rim, deeper into that space, the interior of the canyon, every step you take, every vertical foot that you descend hurls you further and further back into the precincts of the past as you move through, what are really 26 separate layers of rock, all stacked one on top of the other, in a manner in which each layer is younger than the layers below it and older than the layers above it. And so you continue moving backwards through time until you reach the river itself and the world of the sub-basement of the canyon that is surrounded by the Vishnu schist and the Zoroaster granite. This is metamorphic rock whose bloodlines extend 1.7 billion years back into the past. I mean, that's, to put that in perspective, the bottom of Grand Canyon, the rock that forms the basement of Grand Canyon, is roughly a third the age of the planet itself and about 1/10 the age of the universe.
Wow.
And so you are continuously moving through and thinking about time. Geology and time, and what geologists refer to as deep time, are inextricably linked, and these are defining aspects of the landscape and the experience of Grand Canyon.
Well, I think it's a good segue, walking through time, to come back to Colin Fletcher again. He is an extraordinary traveler, adventurer, and he has this experience that you mentioned, and we should say that there are a few characters like this in the book, people who, and we'll come to talk about some of them, people who did these hikes, who tried to make their way in this very difficult part of the world. And Colin Fletcher is interesting because he writes this book, publishes it in 1968. It becomes this bestseller, and you write about the fact that Fletcher, in writing the book, he keeps the spotlight on the land, probably going back to his first encounter, right? Doesn't write about himself, but he publishes this book and it becomes really popular. And your father gets the book. A man, by the way, who didn't want to stray far from home, you say, but he gives you this book. So would you just talk about getting this book written by Colin Fletcher?
Yeah. And, I should probably mention, too, I mean, my father gave me that book. The setting in which that book was given to me by my father is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
This is where I grew up. It's the landscape of my childhood. It's my parents' landscape. And, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with it, I mean, this is a part of Western Pennsylvania that was and to a certain extent still remains one of the most heavily industrialized landscapes in the United States. I mean, this was the center of the United States steel industry, starting in the late 19th century and extending through the better part of the 20th century. It was where the bridges and the skeletal frames of the skyscrapers and the railroads that knit the United States together. It was where that steel was forged. It was where the ore and the coal that was used to burn to heat the blast furnaces was mined. And it was a landscape that prior to the arrival of settlers, must surely have been one of the most gorgeous places on the planet. But when I was growing up, it was a blighted landscape, and there was very little access to what I think of now as wilderness. And there was almost no access to public land. And to give you an idea of how heavily industrialized it was, my father, who loved to hike, the way that he showed opened hiking to me and my brother, was to take us behind our grandparents' house on Sundays when we would go there for family dinner. And we would hike this set of hills behind their house that were called the Spilly Piles.
Right.
And these were basically mining tailings from a giant strip mine where coal had been ripped out of the ground, and the detritus of that operation had been left behind. It was pocketed by these sockets and craters of orange-colored water. The rock itself was black, and that's where we would hike. Those were our mountains. And so all of this is kind of context for my dad, when I was about 10 or 11, picking up at a used book sale a copy of this little book by this man, Colin Fletcher, and handing the thing to me. And the thing that was, I was young enough that, I didn't really respond to the writing at the time, but what grabbed hold of me and wouldn't let go was the photograph on the cover of that book. It's a photograph that Colin Fletcher had taken of himself, probably with a, time-lapse camera. And he's standing on a place that I know well now. It's on a layer of rock we call the Esplanade. It's about 2,500 feet below the rim and a good 2,000 feet above the river. He's looking upstream through a place called Conquistador Alley. And he's standing at the edge of a precipice, holding a walking stick with a huge backpack on his back. And this giant abyss is opening up, this oceanic expanse of rock and light, with this thin, tiny trickle of water flowing through it all the way to the bottom. And there was something about the contrast between the world that I grew up in, defined by steel mills and blast furnaces and mines and spilly piles, and the vision of a different world that was opened, and the possibilities that that world held. It was opened by just the image on the cover of that book. And it gave me this sense that, the road from a place like Pittsburgh to a place like Grand Canyon was incredibly long. But if you traveled it, you could arrive at a place where you could allow your gaze to travel out beyond the furthest horizon that your eyes could see, and what would greet you was nature and wilderness and rock and all of the possibilities that lay inside those things. And it lit a flame inside of me that I don't think has ever been extinguished, even to this day, at the age of 59.
But the thing I wondered about, why did it take you a quarter of a century before you took Fletcher up on his walk? You got this book, right? And not that you needed to act on it right then. You were 11, so that makes sense. But that was one question. And then I also wondered, why did your father give you that book? He never, as you write about in the book, he never went that far from home. But did he want you to? What did you make of the fact that he gave it to you? And how long did you ruminate about what you were going to do about it?
Yeah, Doug, those are both such good questions. Questions that have never been asked of me. In response to the second question first, I don't know what was in my dad's mind at the time. What may have been in his mind is what's in the minds of so many parents. What do? We hand things to our kids, not knowing if it's going to be a seed that we're planting that's going to germinate and flower and grow into a gorgeous giant tree, or like most seeds, if it's just going to fail and not turn into much of anything. I think my I think my father, like many fathers, wanted to just give me a chance to see things and be exposed to things and be inspired by things. I'm not sure that he himself wanted to, go to the Grand Canyon. I'm not sure that he had a concrete idea that, this book would light a fire inside of me, and I would come to define my professional life and my adult life in reference to this landscape. I think he was just trying to allow a place of beauty and a beautiful book to have the chance to inspire me. That's just a guess. I mean, my father passed away between the completion of this hike and the completion of this book, and I can no longer ask those questions of him. I can only speculate, and I'm so sorry. Okay, so I got caught up in my answer, and I forgot what your first question is, but it was a really good one.
Well, it was like, why did it take you a quarter of a century to get to the canyon? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, okay, so that's another good question, and the answer to that, I think, is a little bit embarrassing. It was a really long road that took me from Pittsburgh to the canyon, and led through, college in New York City and graduate school in England, and then back to New York City for a job with a news magazine, and then out to Santa Fe, New Mexico for another magazine, a magazine called Outside, which I had read as a kid. And it wasn't until I was, I think I must have been 35 or 36 that I walked into the boathouse of that river outfitter I described a moment ago, and was confronted by the vision of these dories and inspired to, follow them into the canyon. And why was that road so long? Why was it so convoluted? Why did it take me so long? To be really blunt and honest with you, it was because as a young man, I wasn't living with as much courage as I wish I had. I was looking for the credentials that go with an academic degree. I was looking for a prestigious job. I was looking for an income that would support me. I was paying more attention to those things than I was to the things that spoke to me at a deeper level. And for all of those reasons, I have to say I was not particularly happy as a relatively young man at the start of his career. And I wish now, sometimes young people ask me for advice, and one of the things I try and tell them is to live with as much courage as you can muster. Yeah. And to live with the conviction that I think it's dangerous to tell people to follow their dreams without also warning them that the road to your dreams can be extremely difficult. But one of the regrets that I have now is the time that I wasted in taking so long to get from Pittsburgh to Grand Canyon. So thanks for asking that question, because I haven't really thought about that a great deal, but that's the most honest I can be about that.
So after your encounter, seeing that fleet of rowboats, and that really sort of changed you, you give up on your job. You decide to sign on to be a river guide, and as you say, you spend some time with this at the first part of the book, like not a great one. You struggled. You weren't good at it at first, but you kept at it. And I think that sense of tenacity seems to be a sort of a theme here that we'll maybe come back around to it toward the end. But after being taken by the river and being on the river, it takes a while before you start to think about what life is like moving through that canyon, not by way of the river. And there's this great story that you tell in the book. I wanted to have you talk about it. You were a river guide, and you had encountered some backpackers, and the experience you write about, the look in their eyes, the sense of exhaustion. Would you take us through this story and how that made you start to think about what life must have been like, not here on the river as you were, but up there a little higher? Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, I should say too that, the preface to this story is the extent to which I permitted myself, for very good and compelling reasons, to be utterly and thoroughly seduced by the river. And not just the river itself, but the culture of the river. I immersed myself in the world of these dory boats and the men and women who row the boats and who work as river guides and get to live aboard those boats and spend their summers, moving in an endless circle through the Grand Canyon. It starts at Lee's Ferry, it moves to the Grand Wash Cliffs, and then you go back up to Lee's Ferry in this gorgeous golden circuit that starts with the runoff in April, and it will carry you all the way through to the final weeks of October when the aspen trees on the North Rim are turning gold. And it's a marvelous, wonderful life. And I was utterly taken with it and was intent on climbing the ranks and becoming a dory guide myself before I was thwarted by the, you were very kind a moment ago, but I mean, the truth is that I was totally and utterly incompetent as an oarsman and as someone who could master the subtle art of reading whitewater. I was really, really bad at it. But I was held in the thrall of all of this, the river and the riparian environment along the shoreline and the culture, the subculture of the boats themselves. But then, there's all this rock that stretches on either side. It's just off of your left and your right oarlocks, and it starts at the shoreline and it extends a vertical mile into the sky to both the left and the right, this wedding cake layered structure of cliffs and ledges, and it goes all the way up to the rims. And as boatmen, as water people, we loved the beauty of it and the way it held the light and the texture of the rock and the way it kind of walled and defined our world. But as far as we were concerned, the center of everything, the thing that mattered in Grand Canyon, the thing that created the canyon in the first place, carved and polished and buffed its shape, the thing that nurtured the green ribbon of life along the bottom of it was the Colorado River, and everything else was context. Everything else was context and backdrop and secondary to the magic of the river. And all of that was true up until one summer when we camped at a place called Poncho's Kitchen, which is a kind of a famous river camp. It's right around the center of the canyon. And I was on cook duty that night, and I was standing in the kitchen at our aluminum tables. I think I was chopping vegetables. And the TL, the trip leader, who was a dory boatman by the name of Bronco, I just looked up and I saw him standing at the edge of the river and kind of staring across the water at the far side. And when I followed his gaze, I realized that he was watching a party of 4 backpackers struggle along the shoreline. And, the closer you looked at them, the more you realized, even though they were a good 120 yards away, they were just really toiling. I mean, you could see how the way the muscles in their legs quivered and how much weight they were carrying and how beaten and exhausted they looked. And as I took all of that in, I then turned and then realized that Bronco had already walked over to his boat and untied the lines and was performing this really kind of deft maneuver in which he just, he angled his boat perfectly so it knifed directly across the main current and put him into an eddy directly opposite from where I was standing, where these men were. And I watched as they got into the boat, and then he ferried them back over, and he walked up to me and he said, "Get some more food on. These guys are staying for dinner."
Right.
They spent the night with us. I was too busy that night to sit and talk with them. I did take in, the details. I could see how tattered their clothing was. I could see how sunburned they were. I could gauge their exhaustion by the fact that they didn't even take a bath in the river. They ate 3 or 4 platefuls of food and then they just collapsed for the night. But the thing about them that never left me, the detail that burned itself into my memory, was the look in their eyes. They had this look. It was almost like a kind of, outdoor equivalent of a 1,000-yard stare. And it was exhaustion and weariness and suffering mixed in with this, this glint of something approaching exultation. And it felt haunted to me, as if their eyes were haunted by the things they had seen as they moved through that world of rock that I thought of as just context and backdrop for the river. And it implanted in my mind the idea that world up there, the world where very few people go, the world that the boatmen dismissed, that it held wonders and challenges and experiences that were every bit as profound as those of the river, and maybe even transcended them in some way.
Well, you write about having this kind of question come to you that you describe as heresy, this contradiction. And this is how you put it in the book: the conundrum of a river that felt wild and free, especially at the top of rapids, but that also served as a thoroughfare for travelers who were equipped with many of the same comforts that you would find in a high-end motorhome. And I guess that heresy that comes to you is, how wild is this experience, really? Is that right?
I know it is right. I believe it to be right, although I'm going to get in so much trouble with your listeners who love the Colorado River for saying what I'm about to say.
Well, that's why you use the word heresy, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's utter blasphemy. If you belong to the Church of the Colorado River, it is the thing itself. It is the center of that world. But the thing that I didn't fully understand at the time, Doug, and it took a lot of time, and honestly, it took a lot of reading and thinking to kind of approach this realization. But it's true that, like, if you're in a boat, particularly if you're in a small, hard-hulled boat that will break to pieces if you smash into a rock, the rapids of the Grand Canyon feel like wild, untrammeled nature, wilderness in its purest form. And you feel tiny and utterly at the mercy of these wild forces. What's less obvious, but undeniably true, is that even though that river feels wild and free, every drop of water inside of that river has been metered and rationed and controlled by not just the Glen Canyon Dam that sits at the head of Grand Canyon, but an entire phalanx of like 19 different dams and containment systems and irrigation networks that run from the headwaters of the Colorado River all the way to what used to be the Delta. We have shackled and controlled and brought this river, the greatest river of the American Southwest, under our rule.
Yeah.
And we've done it so thoroughly and so well that some people don't realize or appreciate this, but we use up so much of that water that not a teaspoon of the Colorado River is permitted to reach the Sea of Cortez. It dries up in the desert just south of the Mexican border. And so what that means is that the river isn't really a wild river. What it is plumbing. And what that also means is that, there's about 26,000 boaters that go up and down, that go down the river each year through Grand Canyon. And so if anything goes wrong while you're on the river, if you suffer an accident or somebody has an injury or you break your boat, in about 2 hours, somebody's going to show up with a motor rig and they're going to have They're going to have a repair kit. They're going to have tools. They're going to have a med kit. They're going to have communications gear. They're going to be able to summon a helicopter to evacuate you if you really need to be brought to a hospital on the South Rim. If you want to experience the true wilderness inside of Grand Canyon National Park, you need to leave the river behind. You need to venture up into that matrix of cliffs and ledges where there aren't any trails, where very few people go, and those who do go find themselves utterly and completely at the mercy of nature itself. That's where wildness resides. And it's the contrast between, the way that I first thought about and still love to think about the river, and the fact that it's just not as wild and as free as the story that we tell ourselves, those of us who love it.
Kevin Fedarko, his book is A Walk in the Park, the true story of a spectacular misadventure in the Grand Canyon. You're listening to Radio West. So that gets us to the idea itself of doing this hike. And we have to talk about Pete McBride and your relationship, the idea that he concocts, the way you think about it. Take us to this part of the story, how you start thinking, I'm going to get above this water and I'm going to see the other part of the canyon.
Well, I was when I saw those backpackers and the haunted look in their eye, the look of exultation, I was struck by the idea that, wow, this might be a cool place to explore. But I mean, it never even occurred to me to do it. I didn't have the knowledge or the level of fitness or the wherewithal to even begin to figure it out.
Did you even know that it could be done at that point? From that you could actually, because it seems like part of the mystery that I think there are a lot of people, I was one of them, I wasn't even sure you could hike the extent of that you would, at some point you'd come to a wall and you couldn't move. Or, I mean, you know what I mean?
I do. And, I didn't even know. I mean, I had read Colin Fletcher's book, of course, The Man Who Walked Through Time. But the thing we haven't mentioned is that, when Fletcher wrote that book, he was hiking the length of what was at the time Grand Canyon National Park, whose borders embraced only, just a little bit more than a third of the canyon itself. It wasn't until 1975, through an act of congressional legislation, that the borders of Grand Canyon National Park were expanded to embrace the entire canyon. And so, I was aware that Fletcher had walked the park. I was only vaguely aware that, there were other people out there who had moved through that landscape on foot. But it was an idea that was so, astronomically preposterous that I just didn't even consider it.
Yeah.
Until, this brings me to a deeply problematic figure in my life. So, I have this friend. His name is Pete McBride. He's a National Geographic photographer and filmmaker. And in the early 2000s, he and I hooked up and decided to partner up on what became a series of magazine assignments that took both of us, to some what seemed to us at the time, and still do, some fairly exotic parts of the world. We went to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northern Canada. We went to the Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. We went deep into the Caucasus Mountains in the Republic of Georgia along the border of Chechnya. We went to Everest Base Camp and a couple of camps higher than base camp in Nepal. And all of those assignments, one thing they held in common was that these were assignments that Pete had thought them up and come up with the idea. And each and every one of them had turned into a total and complete debacle, largely because of our incredibly poor planning and inadequate homework. Right. We were always scrambling for assignments and trying to move as fast as possible from one to the next and cutting corners everywhere we went. And things just oh my God, I mean, the things that went wrong. We were sent up to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge along a river called the Firth River, where we were supposed to witness and document and photograph the migration of the porcupine caribou herd. This is, 123,000 caribou that thunder across the alpine tundra. And like, you'd think two National Geographic journalists could actually locate a herd that big, but nope. In the course of 3 weeks, like, we didn't find a single live animal.
You found some antlers.
Well, we found a set of antlers that Pete photographed, and then the very irate fact checker at the magazine we were working for indignantly informed us, correctly informed us, they belonged to a moose, not a caribou.
Right.
So that therein you have a kind of symbolic representation and affirmation of what kind of idiots we were, and so this is all sort of backstory for what happened in the summer of 2014 when Pete showed up in my house in Flagstaff, Arizona, with another new, bold, bad idea. And this idea was that the two of us for National Geographic would put backpacks on and hike the length of the Grand Canyon. And one reason that Pete and I have done all these assignments together is that even though I have known in my bones that each and every one of them was a terrible idea, I have always permitted myself to be talked into joining him on these ventures because he's very good at, he's very seductive when it comes to fast talk and the vision that he creates of the experiences that will await us and the stories that we'll tell and the memories that we'll have afterwards. They always end up pulling me away from, my deeper instincts that this is something we should absolutely not be doing. And so he practiced those dark arts on me with this latest idea. I agreed to accompany him. And this was the one assignment that we got in so far over our heads that it just fell apart completely.
Yeah. Well, this is the essence, of course, of what the book is about. And I'll leave it to readers to go through those stories. But let's talk about parts. Let's talk about your first sort of initial it fits and starts, I guess we could describe it that way. And the initial idea, the initial trek, there's a great scene that I think it really illustrates just how completely clueless you guys were when you first embarked on all of this. And that is when you're trying to put your pack together. And we should also maybe at this point, I think, Kevin, introduce listeners, as you do in the book, to your companions, the ones who actually know what they were doing. And they're watching you as you and Pete try to put together your pack for this incredibly difficult excursion. It's a really good scene, and I think it says just exactly what you had no idea about. But talk a little bit about this, if you would.
Well, yeah. So the origin of this scene is that Pete did so many things wrong. I did a lot of things wrong too, but I like to blame all of them on him.
Yes.
One of the things he did right, however, one of the few things for which he should be commended is that he heard about a group of highly experienced ultra long distance backpackers who had been preparing for years for a continuous through hike of the canyon. And it's important, by the way, I should just explain something here, that there's a difference between through hiking continuously, which is to say starting at the beginning and not stopping and not coming out to reprovision or rest, and what's known as a sectional through hike, which is where you divide up the through hike into sections and you tackle each of them, but you're able to take breaks between them. So these guys were doing the much more difficult and formidable goal of a continuous through hike. And here again, we have Pete's seductiveness and fast talking. He managed to talk these guys into permitting us to allow to accompany them for the first leg, what we envision would be the first leg of our sectional through hike.
Yeah.
And Pete thought that this was just fabulous because, as he told me, he said, "Look, we're gonna get to accompany these guys along. We're gonna learn all the stuff that we don't know that we need to learn in this first leg, and here's the most beautiful part of all: we don't even need to be in shape for this thing because the hike itself is going to be the thing that gets us in shape for the hike." Yeah. And so by the time that we're done with this first section and we've been tutored by these experts, we're just going to emerge as these like tanned Adonis-like backpacking experts. And we don't really need to lift a finger. And so, that was how we found ourselves in late September of 2015, camped on the remote part of the east rim of Grand Canyon, up near Lee's Ferry, meeting these guys for the first time and preparing to get our packs in order so that we could all go down to Lee's Ferry and begin our hike the very next day. And it just gives you an idea of how chaotic and disorganized Pete and I were, that, we were so late in getting there that it was pitch dark by the time we pulled up in my truck. And, we got out of the truck. These guys were sitting off in the distance by a campfire. And we came around the back of the truck and opened up the tailgate, and all of these boxes from REI and Patagonia, God only knows where else, that had been mailed to my house in Santa Fe that I was supposed to have, taken out of their boxes and unpacked and tested. They all come, there's this miniature avalanche of boxes that falls to the ground, and we have to locate our brand new headlamps and then the batteries and figure out how to turn them on, and then begin the process of unpacking all this gear and cutting the price tags off and figuring out whether the fuel canisters actually screw properly onto our high-tech stove. And eventually these guys come around to the back of the truck and turn their headlamps on and are just appalled by the clownish incompetency that they're witnessing, and horrified by the realization that we are not nearly as experienced as Pete has represented us to be, and that they are going to be stuck with us for the next 2 weeks.
And that you had, I don't know, how many pounds was that? Maybe it wasn't, I'm not sure how much it weighed, but you had this powdered Gatorade, and you had all of these things that I think it was Dave Nally, who was one of these experts, just sort of tossed to the side. Like it was absurd, the weight and the amount of stuff that you had for this incredibly difficult hike.
Yeah, I mean, we had a ground tarp that I had gone out and purchased at Home Depot, which was this blue Windex blue plastic monstrosity that was designed to, protect like an RV or a boat. We had a gallon Ziploc bag filled with, what looked like cocaine, but was actually, about 4 pounds of Gatorade, powdered Gatorade mix. We had a plastic shovel. I had a box of hypoallergenic baby wipes and 2 tubes of toothpaste. Anyone who's listening to this right now who has any experience in long-distance desert backpacking will not only be shaking their heads, but asking, is this really true? Can 2 people be this incompetent and actually show up expecting to do a through hike of Grand Canyon? And, I have to say that, I'm in the business of writing nonfiction, and unfortunately it is all true. It's a testament, too, to the fact that Pete and I were both part of the river world, and one of the things that you get to do if you're a boat person is bring everything, including the kitchen sink. Yeah. Propane canisters, aluminum tables, 8-burner stoves, Dutch ovens, coolers filled with fresh vegetables. It all goes down the river. And if that's the context in which you experience, a place like Grand Canyon, you come to the business of backpacking with a set of assumptions that are just fundamentally inappropriate. And that was what was on display at the start of our venture. Yeah.
Well, again, I won't give too much away about what happens on that leg. I mean, and it's a really good tale about how you go through all of this. I did want to ask, how do you describe the heat? Can you explain it to someone who hasn't experienced it? Did you ever think you would die? Talk about the actual level of danger in that place.
I'm trying to call to mind a line somewhere in the book where I talk about something that struck me from the very first day. Because unfortunately, we through no fault of anyone's, we ended up embarking on the start of this through hike in the midst of what was a really unseasonable late September heat wave.
Yeah.
And the temperatures during the day were pushing well over 100, even into the 100 and teens. And I remember at a certain point kind of just pausing. And here you got to remember too, like as a river person, you're always kind of floating along this cushion of cool air that hovers just above the river. It's kind of like a refrigerator running through the canyon. And if you ever start to overheat, even in that context, you just jump into the river to cool off. And so what I was feeling was that the full heat of the canyon, unbuffered and unmitigated by anything. And what struck me more than the specific index of the temperature or the kind of glare of the sunlight was the weight of it. I mean, it felt as if I could feel the heat, as if it were like an enormous blanket that had been draped over my head and neck and shoulders and was bearing down and pressing down on me. And it was woven from a fabric that had been delivered into the hands of its weaver while it was on fire. That's what that heat felt like. And that is a defining element of moving through a desert canyon surrounded by rock that begins to act, shortly after the sun has topped over the rim and lit the place on fire like a convection oven. And there's nothing quite like it, particularly if you're experiencing its full force for the first time.
I wanted to ask you about another one of the characters you write about in the book. It's another person who knew the river in that canyon like you did, but who, like you, wanted to get up above it, and that's Kenton Grua. Say a little bit about him and the influence that he had on the way you experienced that trip. His trip seemed to have these themes. Talk about Kenton Grua.
Well, Kenton Grua was a dory boatman who I have kind of a deep connection to, even though he and I never met. He passed away a year or two before I first came to the river. But, he formed an incredibly important part of the experience that I had as a boatman because I mentioned a few minutes ago that I had this dream of becoming a dory guide, and it was a failed dream because I was so incompetent as a boatman. But I kept coming back and working for free as an apprentice boatman on these dory trips for the better part of 5 or 6 summers during the early 2000s. And the reason for that is because one of the things that I got to do by virtue of being part of a river crew was sit around and listen to the boatmen do what they do at night at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. If it's the summer, they gather on the decks of their boats, and if it's the shoulder seasons, they gather around a campfire. And they do the only thing better than rowing whitewater, which is to tell stories about the river and weave a part of the tapestry of the oral history of the river by just telling stories. And the longer I spent sitting around listening to those stories, the more I began to realize that so many of them revolved around and traced back to the story of – it was one story. It was the story of this legendary year, 1983, that saw the biggest El Nino event on record to that point, which laid down an epic snowpack in the southern Rockies, all of which melted in late May when the temperatures suddenly shot up into the high 90s, and all that water came out of the mountains in one huge rush. And it all wound up behind the Glen Canyon Dam in Lake Powell, that great 186-mile-long reservoir that stretches upstream from the parapets of the dam. And it was coming out of the mountains so hard and so fast that it took everybody by surprise, and it began climbing the walls of the dam and threatening to overtop the parapets. And the engineers at the dam faced this tremendous crisis. The integrity of the dam was being brought into question, and they released everything they had, every valve and penstock and even the spillway tunnels, and just sent as much of that water as they could into the canyon, and it created a giant flood. And this boatman named Kenton Grua, who had a little dory called the Emerald Mile, developed the rather harebrained idea that he and two friends would ride the crest of that flood through the length of Grand Canyon and set a speed record for the fastest boat ever to go through the canyon. And so, the story of my kind of indentured years as a failed river guide in Grand Canyon is bookended by the fact that at the end of that experience, I wrote a book called The Emerald Mile, which told the story of Kenton's speed run, and used that to write a kind of love letter to the hidden world of whitewater and wooden boats at the bottom of the canyon. The thing that I talked about a little bit in the book, but not a lot, was that in addition to setting this historic speed record, Kenton Grua was so fascinated by and obsessed with and in love with the landscape of Grand Canyon that he also became the first person in modern recorded history to figure out how to do what Colin Fletcher did not, which was to walk the entire length of Grand Canyon. And he did it in 1973, and he's the first person to kind of figure out how to thread through this, incredibly complex matrix of cliffs and ledges and move all the way from Lee's Ferry to the Grand Wash Cliffs. And so he is a figure for me who stands at the center of how I regard both the world of the river and the world of the rock inside Grand Canyon.
Kevin Fedarko. His new book is A Walk in the Park, the true story of a spectacular misadventure in the Grand Canyon. You're listening to Radio West. So, Kevin, there's this contrast I wanted to ask you about and kind of underline in this part of the story between what seems like utter silence, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, but I wanted to contrast that with the moment you write later in the trip. In this section, I think it's called Burnt Canyon. You're next to the Colorado River. You talk about in the book how in the morning you heard this roar of helicopters. And it's this section you describe as the combat zone. And the leader, Rich, who's with you, talks about how that drone of helicopters was like this punch to the jaw. And you write about the efforts to kind of protect the soundscape of the region and what had been done to the canyon. I think this is Helicopter Alley, I think it's described with, and it really illustrates what's happening in that canyon, at least in terms of like tourism and that really some of the challenges to alter that landscape and the soundscape. Will you talk about this, the I guess the noise? Talk about that.
Well, this is something we encountered very late in our journey in the far western part of Grand Canyon. And by the time we arrived there, Pete and I had been struck by something, an epiphany that kind of cut against the grain of how we understood the land. By this point, we had spent a great deal of time moving through the eastern and central parts of the canyon in multiple back-to-back expeditions. And we'd both come to the place sort of framing and thinking about the wonder of the canyon in the way that many, many people do. And this is particularly true of Pete as a photographer, but also true of me as a writer. You know, when you think about a landscape like Grand Canyon, when you try and like talk about it and tell other people why it's so special, why it matters, we talk about elements like color, you know, the color of the rock or the texture of the cliffs or the scale of the landscape itself and the way that it can dilate from the grand and the magnificent to the minute. And when we're doing those things, when we're referring to those elements, what we're doing is we're invoking the vocabulary of the eye. Yeah. We're framing our understanding of the wonders of this place in the context of what you can see. And this epiphany that Pete and I experienced is that the longer we spent inside the landscape, the more time we spent there, the more deeply connected with it we became, the more struck we were by the thought that one of the elements that was moving us more than any other was not visual, it was auditory. Yeah. It was this, you know, deep and dense and like crystalline blanket of, I want to say silence, but it's not really silence, it's stillness. Because you can hear natural sounds inside of the canyon, you know, the trickle of water, the singing of birds, the coming and goings of, you know, small insects and mammals, the rustling that the wind makes as it runs its fingers across the land. But there is a stillness and a tranquility that is kind of monumental. And the longer you steep yourself inside of that, the more you begin to realize that those qualities are starting to enter into you, that the tranquility of the land somehow injects itself into you. And all of this stands in profound contrast to the noise that we make in, you know, what Pete and I came to think of as the world beyond the rims. I mean, that world, the world that is not inside of Grand Canyon, is defined in so many ways by noise. It's endless. And when Pete and I would come out from these segments, we'd be struck by how loud it was. And so we came to just appreciate more and more the silence and the stillness as we moved ever further west until we got to this place that you referred to a moment ago, known as Helicopter Alley. It's a stretch of the river where one of the 11 Native American tribes of the Grand Canyon, the Wallapai tribe, whose reservation abuts Grand Canyon National Park, it extends right down to the river. And the Wallapai, for a whole set of, it's important to say, legitimate reasons, a desire to pursue and benefit from and partake in a level of economic prosperity that has been unreachable to them for the better part of the past 150 years since their first encounter with white settlers, a level of prosperity that is open to anyone who lives beyond the borders of Native American reservations in this country. The Wallapai have decided to partner up with a set of air tour companies operating out of Las Vegas that have literally flooded the interior of the canyon with hundreds of helicopter flights each and every day. You know, these flights penetrate beneath the rims of the canyon, which is allowed nowhere else, nowhere in the national park. They land in the canyon at a series of helipads. The people who purchase tickets for those flights are able to disembark without hiking a single step and board a motorized boat for a short boat tour and then get an exciting ride back out of the canyon, unaware that the recreation and sightseeing in which they are indulging is destroying the soundscape of the canyon. And, you know, I'll admit that, like, these are controversial statements that I'm making. There are people, no doubt, listening to this right now who have strong feelings that air tours are appropriate and valuable and an important way of experiencing a national park like Grand Canyon. And what I would simply say is that based on my experience inside of Grand Canyon, I fundamentally disagree with that. I think it's an abuse and an inappropriate use of airspace. and it is shattering and destroying what may well be the most profound, least appreciated, and most vulnerable treasure inside of Grand Canyon, which is the silence and stillness.
It makes me think of something that Diana Ukwala told you and Pete, because you write in the book that if you and Pete weren't meant to see anything, maybe you were supposed to listen, and what you were meant to hear was silence. It seems like this idea of silence, when I think about Colin Fletcher, that was the thing he noticed. And it seems like that's part of the theme, or part of one of the themes anyway, in the book. But would you just mention Diana Ukwala, who seemed to be getting at that when she told you and Pete to slow down?
So Diana Ukwala is a member of the Havasupai tribe. And so this is one of 11 Native American tribes whose ancestral lands either abut or lie directly inside of what is now Grand Canyon National Park. Each and every one of these tribes is a sovereign nation and a separate and distinct culture whose ancestors were connected with and had an understanding of the land that extends deeper than any person who looks or sounds like me can begin to imagine. And all of these tribes were evicted from what is now this national park in the process of creating the park in the first place. And not only were they physically removed from land that was their home, they were then written out of the history of that land. You know, this is a little understood and very poorly acknowledged aspect of our national parks system. A national parks idea that, you know, many of us think of as one of America's finest ideas. I myself think of that as well, but I did not understand until I undertook this hike and began encountering these tribes and reading about their histories that, you know, this is a flawed set of ideas, and that we have, in the process of creating our national parks, we created a profound set of injustices that were inflicted upon people indigenous to these landscapes that we now protect. So Diana Ukwala is a member of the Havasupai tribe, which occupies a reservation in the central part of Grand Canyon. And an incredibly important aspect of this journey and the story that came out of it is the series of encounters that Pete and I were privileged to have with members of these tribes as we moved through the canyon. They wanted to meet with us. They wanted to tell us their stories. They wanted us to understand what the land meant to them. And Diana Ukwala requested that we meet with her at the head of the Bright Angel Trail on the south rim of the canyon. And when we met with her, the first thing she did was, you know, she said, she gave us her name. She explained that she was from the Havasupai tribe and that that her home village, Supai Village, that we would be walking through it a week or two into the next leg of our journey. And she said, "Here, I brought something for each of you." And she handed us these tiny leather pouches that were filled with tobacco. She instructed us to sprinkle the tobacco at springs that we encountered to give thanks to the land. She told us that each and every morning we needed to rub our hands with sage leaves and then rub our faces so that the land would come to recognize us. And she said that you're in the midst of a very powerful journey, that at the end of this journey you will have been changed, that in order to truly understand what the land is trying to tell you and teach you, you need to slow down, you need to pay attention, and you need to listen. You need to listen to what the animals are trying to tell you, the lizards and the birds. You need to attend to things by paying attention. And what I didn't understand in that moment and came to understand and appreciate only much later was that, you know, when she was telling us to listen to the creatures of the canyon, she wasn't just talking about the birds and the reptiles and the animals. She was talking about its people. She was talking about its tribes. She wanted us to pay attention to their stories and to integrate those stories into our experience of the place. And in many ways, Doug, this is a book whose frame is a kind of it's a chronicle of a bumbling odyssey between two profoundly impaired men who haven't done their homework and gotten their act together in a way that would enable them to move through this landscape responsibly. But the heart and the soul of this book is the tribes of the canyon, the encounters that we had with them, and the way that they transformed my own understanding of the landscape and the park.
Let me ask you this finally. You have this really interesting insight at the end of the book. You say that there's a part of you that believes that, really only on foot, the hard way to move. That's the real way to make contact with this landscape. But then you kind of equivocate or you rethink that. And you also wonder if maybe the opposite is also true, that even though the hordes of people, the tourists who hadn't gone through what you had, they were, and this is how you put it in the book, they were convinced that they were in the midst of a marvelous adventure. It's this reevaluation almost, I think is how you say. Abrupt reevaluation is how you put it, of what you had just done. What are you trying to say there?
I guess in some ways it was the final lesson that I was taught. It was the very last leg of our hike. It was a gap that I left because I had to go back and attend to my father, who was receiving chemotherapy for the cancer that would soon kill him, and I had to go back and do that leg after we reached the end of Grand Canyon, the western end of Grand Canyon, and that leg, the end of that leg was hiking up the Bright Angel Trail, one of the most heavily trafficked thoroughfares inside of the park. And keep in mind, Doug, that throughout the rest of our journey over the course of that entire year, we had seen almost no one as we hiked the trailless backcountry of the canyon. And there I found myself just being passed by hundreds of tourists, of every size and shape, wearing, clothing from running gear to high-heeled shoes, and some of them carrying styrofoam cups of coffee and newspapers or magazines in their hands, and others running up and down the trail and speaking this medley of languages from all over the world. And I reached the top of the trail and I was kind of looking down at the switchbacks and seeing this kind of colorful human pageant unfold before me. And I don't write about this in the book, but what I thought of the Canterbury Tales. All these different people from all walks of life. Your listeners will maybe remember the Canterbury Tales from high school, that, it's a group of people who are moving to the shrine of Thomas à Becket, and they come from all over medieval England. There's a friar and there's a prioress and there's a blacksmith and there's a knight. And they're all brought together by this journey, and they're all pilgrims, and they're all moving on foot, and they are all experiencing something marvelous, and they are all in search of a miracle. And they all are given a gift in one form or another that they get to take with them at the end of their journey. And one of the things that Grand Canyon does, and it did this to Pete and I, is that by virtue of being so harsh and so brutal, it strips away all of the layers of arrogance and hubris, and it leaves you kind of confronted with bedrock, for better or worse, who you are as a human being. And it has a way of extinguishing ego. And it might have been possible in that moment, sitting at the head of the Bright Angel Trail, looking down into the canyon, contemplating this epic journey that I had just completed, for me to have decided that I was superior to all of these people laid out on the trail before me, because I had traveled further and suffered more and seen deeper than any of them. But what I really was struck by was the idea that we all held this thing in common, that we were all pilgrims. We were all moving by the humblest slowest and the means of movement that is most open to meditation and contemplation, which is walking. And that we were all trafficking in miracles. And that's part of the gift that's handed to us by these landscapes, by these parks, that for all of their flaws and all of the injustices that attended their creation are still filled with wonder.
Kevin Fedarko, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's such a privilege.
Kevin Fedarko. His latest book is called A Walk in the Park, the true story of a spectacular misadventure in the Grand Canyon. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and we're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. You can also send us suggestions and ideas. You can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. The program is produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Kerry Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.